Hey guys, it's Frozenballz here, and welcome to another episode of the Minmaxer's Playground. Today, we are going to be covering Saryn. I know Saryn is a frame a lot of people have requested multiple times in the past, and I've wanted to cover her. There were some other frames which I wanted to do first though. Plus, Saryn requires some preparation and information which I needed to test to explain a bunch of things about her. This video will be a little bit longer as well as a little bit technical, since it requires explanations into how Saryn works, how her rework changed her abilities, and everything else that came with the rework itself. First things first, we all know that Saryn was reworked around update 17.10. The changes affected a bunch of abilities, even her passive. Her passive now increases the duration of all status effects by 25%. For a frame that is designed around dots, this is a very good change, and it works exceptionally with the build that I use. Without further ado, let's jump right into the changes. So the first change was for Miasma. Pre-work, Miasma was one of the strongest AoE nuke abilities in the game, and it benefited from negative power duration. Lower duration meant that the additional ticks were done over a much shorter period, doing much more damage. This way you were able to nuke for up to 25k damage. This was before mods like power drift, energy conversion were even a thing. Post-rework, Miasma's damage is no longer condensed down with negative duration. In fact, negative duration decreases Miasma's damage potential, since Miasma's damage is tied directly to duration and damage ticks. Lower duration means less ticks, which means lower damage, but that's not all. The biggest change is that the damage of Miasma is now tremendously lower, and to get even close to the damage of pre-rework Miasma build, you need to proc both Toxin and Viral and run a max power strength, which is very energy heavy. Sadly, the only use for Miasma at the moment is the short stun that it provides. Molt was also changed, now allowing you to cast spores on it, which is pretty handy. The ability itself creates a decoy that draws aggro. Upon detonation, it will spread a toxin proc. If spores are on Molt and you cast it again, all spores will be popped, spreading both viral and toxin procs very quickly. Molt's augment is called Regenerative Molt. This is a pretty decent ability. Basically, it gives Saryn a way of healing herself. The ability suffers badly, however, from scaling, as the health of the decoy only scales so far, and the aggro cannot be affected by range, and it is inconsistent at best. Its primary use for our builds is on stationary missions such as Berahinia or Hydron, or any other missions as such. Next up is Spore. This ability got the most changes and is the primary way to play Saryn right now. Spores do a guaranteed viral proc on explosion of the spore. If an enemy is affected by a toxin proc, it will transfer that proc as well. Spores will do 20 viral damage per tick over 12 seconds. Each spore popped will spread 3 new spores to any enemy within 16 meters of that spore. If you pop a spore on an enemy affected by a toxin proc, then it will spread that toxin proc as well as the spore. That spore will take 25% of your base damage that popped the spore, and it will add viral damage with guaranteed viral and toxin procs. It is important to know that spores do not overwrite each other, and only one spore's ticks will affect an enemy at any given time. The ticks cannot be refreshed or stacked, which hinders her a lot. Popping spores can be done through all sorts of damage, whether it's friendly fire, enemies, or even environmental. The next change is for Contagion, now known as Toxic Lash. This ability has been given a higher base duration and damage, and a bonus added where while Toxic Lash is active, you get a bonus in damage reduction when you block with your melee weapon. Toxic Lash applies toxin damage with every melee strike, and the damage bonus is affected by power strength mods. Toxin Lash adds 30% of total weapon damage as toxin damage. However, it is important to note that the toxin damage attributed to Toxin Lash acts as a separate damage source and does not combine with the weapon's own stats or mods. Toxin Lash also has synergy with spores, where each melee strike pops 1 spore guaranteed, and each spore that is on an enemy that is popped using Toxin Lash will restore 2 energy back to Saryn as well. Since Toxin Lash has 100% chance to apply toxin status to enemies, this can be used as a good status spreader for applying toxin damage to enemies, and thus setting up a second damage buff for Miasma. Also, Toxic Proc does 50% bonus damage of the damage take as well. With all of this information in mind, let's talk about the build. Saryn's build is typically the same throughout due to her requiring a more or less a rainbow mod setup to be effective. Since your main damage source will be either Spore or Toxin Lash combined with Spore, the core underlying statement of Saryn is dots. This means you require high duration, and this is achieved by using prime continuity. Since spores are all about spreading damage, this also means you need range, and this is achieved by combining stretch, overextended, and cunning drift together for maximum range. Power strength strength is required for a higher damage per tick with your Toxin Lash as well as a higher buff for Toxin Lash, therefore requiring a combination of Transient Fortitude, Power Drift, and a rank 7 Blind Rage. The reason for the rank 7 Blind Rage is due to the cost versus effectiveness relationship. Any higher power strength just adds a much higher cost for casting Spore, which will end up being used a lot anyway, and at that point the cost does not outweigh the damage potential enough to warrant using a max Blind Rage. Since we are using Blind Rage, Streamline is a good mod to help alleviate some of that power efficiency penalty that Blind Rage gives, allowing for more spammability. Prime Flow gives Saryn a huge power pool, which also helps with the spammability as well at the same time. As usual, Corrosive Projection is the aura of choice unless you wish to mod for something else, depending on what enemy you're currently fighting and what level they are. In terms of Arcanes, Arcane Energize is still one of the best Arcanes that you can use with the Saryn, just because of how spammability and how much of a caster-based frame she is. Because we are running a glass cannon build, we will be relying on Naramon to keep us alive as well, especially at high level missions. Normally, I always say that weapons are not exclusive to Warframes due to the way the game is designed, and that people can use whatever they want. Technically, that is still valid. However, there are some clear examples of weapons that synergize very well with Saryn, namely weapons like the Nikana Prime, the Legion, the Mios, Staticor for spreading status, Hiku Prime for quickly spreading spores, and the Lanka for high damage toxin procs. One of the reasons why the Mios and Nikana Prime are so good is due to the 4 status procs included in their stance combos, as well as the massive damage bonuses that they have. Case in point, the Mios has a disgusting 1325% damage bonus as part of the combo, and this combo is also affected by Condition Overload, which we will go into detail later on. Saryn really has 2 ways of playing her. Because you can't stack or refresh spores, you can either abuse the tick damage and spread spores with Molt for viral and toxin ticks. This is mostly used for farming missions, and ideal weapons for spreading spores are Hiku or the Torrid, for example. You can take this a step further and use a Gas Lanka to proc very high toxin procs. Why Lanka and why Gas? The Lanka is one of the strongest hitting weapons in the game with high crit and status and only has 1 elemental. With Gas, you're only fighting with electric to get a gas proc, and gas procs have a toxin proc on them as well. This allows you to deal with level 80 plus enemies rather easily. The second way to play her is by abusing the viral explosions from Spore with a strong melee weapon. Because of Toxin Lash and the very strong melee options, you can hit for some very high numbers. And as stated earlier on, when a target is affected by a toxin proc, spores that are spread will carry over that toxin proc. Toxin Lash guarantees a toxin proc, and it will carry over 25% of the base damage modified with mods and power strength. This is extremely strong when comboed with the right mods, which I will also talk about in a little bit. Saryn has a very high energy pool, some good armor, and decent health pool, making her pretty beefy. Regardless, you can mod your Saryn a bit more defensively if you don't like relying on Naramon. Just keep in mind that when you are going for melee, range is the most important stat to take into consideration. Now that I've talked about the abilities, how they function, and how the build works, I need to cover some of the problems that Saryn has. She is riddled to the brim with bugs. I mean, she has the potential to be a frame that has insane scaling and to be one of the single most powerful DPSs in the game, but she suffers from so many bugs and limitations that it more or less neuters her potential in many situations. Casting spores on an enemy and popping them with a toxin or gas-based weapon does not always transfer the toxin proc. The spore also does not transfer the full toxin proc to enemies either. Instead, the damage transfer is the flat damage of spore being amplified by a power strength. Non-infected enemies will be hit from the viral explosion when you pop a spore and transfer toxin via the spore. But wait up, that spore burst explosion damage is also bugged, and it only takes into account the biggest toxin proc currently on the target instead of taking the full combined toxin damage into account. And this is why we use the Gas Lanka as a damage dealer, by the way, to ensure that the toxin proc is high enough to kill high level enemies. According to the dev workshop regarding the Saryn rework, it was intended to take all of that into account. Popping multiple spores in general doesn't really have any added benefit due to the fact that multiple spore pops do not refresh, nor do they add to the duration of the dot. Furthermore, only one single spore will transfer the toxin damage. The only reason to pop spores is to spread it to new enemies currently unaffected by them. Albeit not a bug, but Miasma does not apply corrosive procs anymore either, it just does a straight up dot damage. Toxin Lash also does not add the correct amount of toxin damage to your melee strikes. Another thing to consider is that the toxin proc damage carried over from spores is also being reduced by armor as it acts like normal damage, further limiting her potential as well. Despite all of this, there is something that makes Saryn a pretty monstrous DPS. It is one of the best melee mods to be released since the Acolyte mods. 2 words: Condition Overload. Let's forget the bugs and other issues with Saryn for a minute and focus on this amazing mod. Condition Overload does plus 60% extra melee damage for each status type affecting the target. Saryn is a status frame by design. I mean, she has a passive that increases status duration by 25%, and she is built 100% around dots from Spores and Toxin Lash. Toxin Lash has a guaranteed application of toxic procs with melee weapons with each hit, while Spore spreads viral damage extremely efficiently. You are not only debuffing the enemy's HP with viral procs, but simultaneously buffing your own damage output as well with 2 procs from the get-go. You are also abusing arguably the strongest weapon category in the game right now, which is melee. And you can also apply even more procs through your other weapons. The bonus damage applied by Condition Overload is multiplicatively added to your melee damage. Normally, I always stray away from using weapons on Sentinels, but seeing as the Arcanes is a free cold proc, it's essentially free DPS. That's 3 procs off the bat before you even start to melee enemies. As it stands, there are a total of 14 different types of status procs you can have. However, Gas has 2 different procs, yes, but both act as toxin procs, reducing that proc total down to 13. The way Condition Overload works is shown by the formula shown on screen. Now, I'm a sucker for numbers. Let me show you why. Just look at those multipliers with each additional proc that's added on top. With 13 different procs, that's a 450 times multiplier for Condition Overload. It is important to note that Blast actually has 2 separate procs. One, which is the stagger or stun from recovering victims, and this is shown as the status icon, on the UI itself. The other one is the actual knockdown caused by the blast proc as well, and this is not shown as an icon, but it still does contribute towards Condition Overload. Honestly, this is huge. The best thing about this mod is that it's just status. This means that you or your allies or even the environment can proc, and it will add to your damage buff. Combine this with your usual Blood Rush maiming builds or with a more status oriented build, and you're looking at numbers into the millions. As an example of the effectiveness of combining Condition Overload with Saryn, here is a loadout which I use pretty often. Nikana Prime and Mios are my favorites when running Condition Overload. Their stances give insane damage buffs, on top of proccing Slash and Ragdoll on their combos as well. I use either Electric, Corrosive or Blast for the extra procs. A Staticor modded for Radiation, Magnetic and Fire helps us get 6 status procs. Saryn herself spreads viral and toxin like crazy, and we haven't even mentioned our little buddy the Arcanes. That's 9 procs of a freaking 68.72 multiplier. Suddenly, our bug-ridden frame has some insane damage potential, and combined with her spores and the damage that it should transfer, you'll be clearing out rooms very, very fast. I just love this mod. It's amazing. Saryn as a Warframe after her rework had the potential to be a very, very well scaling, extremely powerful caster-based frame with massive damage potential, but sadly riddled with so many bugs that actually shackle her true potential. When people say her rework was a nerf, they're not completely wrong. She turned from an AoE nuke frame into an AoE nuke frame with more bugs. I mean, her Miasma even got a very small corrosive proc chance removed to make sure it wasn't worthy at all. When an Oberon ult does more damage than a supposedly strong nuke ability that corrodes enemies, based on the description, there's obviously something wrong here. Saryn's rework is not synergy, it's dependency. An ability should be good on its own, and better when used with others, not bad on its own and slightly usable when you're combining it with others. I don't want to make this into a rant video. This is just highlighting the problems that exist with Saryn and bringing to light the information that people may or may not know about Saryn and why Saryn is not as good as she used to be. I hope you liked what you saw and it brought a little bit more information about Saryn to your attention, and then you can mod and play her accordingly now. I would like to point out a couple of things. 1, my glyph code is now available on PC, PS4 and Xbox One. If you would like one, join my Discord. The link will be given in descriptions. Secondly, my build albums, which cover all of my min-max builds, are found in my description as well. Those are basically all of my builds with a short description for them, but a YouTube video is basically going to be the one which you want to go for if you want like a detailed explanation about what I use for that build, why it functions the way it does. Thank you very much for being here, guys. As usual, if you like what you saw, consider giving a like, a subscribe, a comment, share it with the others, let other people know about Saryn, and let me know what you thought about the video as well in a comment. And I'll see you guys in the next one.